I went through a year and a half of homelessness as a result of the child abuse that I was suffering, particularly the emotional violence that I was suffering in my home. My mother was my main bully perpetrator. I started running away around the age of 5, 6 years old after she dropped me out of a 2-story window. We lived in Montreal at the time. When I was running away between that time and the age of 9, I was running to find my biological father because he wasn't a part of my life then. And that's a whole nother story. Eventually, my mother showed up, and I was living with my grandparents, so I was running from their house in particular. My mother wasn't a part of that situation. She would float in and out. She would definitely traumatize me when she floated in and out, but she wasn't around with any sort of regularity, and I was running with some pretty good regularity. And it was also keeping it, for the most part, I only got caught once, under the radar. I knew that my father worked in a tall building in Montreal. He worked at the Forum. He used to be the vice president of the Montreal Forum. And I would walk and try to find the tall building. I could see it in the distance. And I was never met with any success. Anyway, my mother married an American who lived in Miami, and she showed up with my new stepdaddy, who turned out to be wonderful. And we moved to Miami. And now I hadn't lived with my mother for around 4 years. And here I was in a new place with a new stepdaddy and my mother and all of that. When he would travel, I would run away. My mother would up her abuse, and most of that abuse was emotional. And it wasn't something that I could even explain or talk about or tell on. And I already knew from the age of 4 that I was the family liar. I wasn't going to be believed. So my coping mechanism was flight. And I used to run all the time. And then my stepfather died. And then she met another one. And after they got married, I got to meet him. And I kept on running until I went to boarding school. When I was at boarding school, I was 12 years old. I was at a very nice boarding school in Connecticut. Shout out to Cheshire Academy. I loved it there. I had a whole school year of experiencing a sense of normalcy, like real normalcy, not my normal, but a normal that didn't include being terrorized. And the school year ended, my mother told me I wouldn't be going back. And she did it in like this whole manipulative way. And maybe I'll do a whole series on this and do that whole thing that everybody's doing, part 1 through a zillion. If you want me to do that, let me know and I'll start it. Anyway, when I got back and she told me I wasn't going back to boarding school, and then sent me to my grandfather, and my grandmother wasn't there. So I was going to go through what I thought was a double whammy of abuse, because my grandfather was a child. And I lost it. And so I ran again. And it's the first time I had run in an entire school year, because it was the first time that I had been back in that environment that created my need to run. And I ended up living on the streets for a year and a half until I found a job as a cocktail waitress and ended up finding my own apartment, which did not put me out of harm's way. I was trafficked for labor about a year into having my own place. I didn't have it anymore. I also spent a lot of times going hungry, because when it came down to food or rent, I always chose rent. I was also living in Miami in the late 70s, early 80s. So that was the height of the Coca-Cola cowboy, I'm gonna put it that way, so my video doesn't get pinged. The height of that, and it was the height of the Mariel crisis, the refugees coming in from Cuba. And so it was a huge war zone down in South Beach, which was literally where I was living. It was like honky-tonk bars and dangerous, and I can't even begin to describe it to you. I made it through all that because I didn't end up doing drugs. I did learn how to cut the Coca-Cola and serve it at parties, because I met another runaway who was on the streets, and we pretended to be cousins. She became my street family, and she showed me a better way to navigate homelessness. Before her, I had been living on park benches and abandoned buildings. after her, we would live in apartment complex saunas, which, got a shower and a bathroom and a whole thing. And we would also crash at these Coca-Cola houses, and most of them were really nice. She knew everyone. She had been out there for quite some time. I was fortunate not to end up in a situation where I was selling myself, because there was a woman who took me in about a month after I was on the streets for a couple of days and explained to me what she was doing and that she was on drugs. And I mean, I had no concept. All I knew was this woman was so beautiful to me, and I don't know what happened to her. I don't remember her name. I wish that somehow I could find her to thank her, because she saved my life. Because when I left her, she made me promise I would go home, and what I promised myself was that I would never do drugs and I would never sell my body. That doesn't mean that I didn't have survival sex, meaning that sometimes when I was really desperate for food, if somebody asked me for, told me they'd feed me or give me a roof over my head, I would go with them. And while I knew what they wanted from me and didn't want to participate, I would give in, because that was my option. And not for nothing, these were grown men, older men, and I was a little kid of 13 years old. This is pretty much what I look like. So anyway, that's how I survived homelessness for the most part. The Cliff Note version. If you want to learn more, by the way, I also have a TEDx talk, so you can find that in the link in my bio if you're interested in watching the TEDx.